are backed by substantial amounts of field work. Austin is a real boots-on-the-ground guy. He just got back last week from a 3-month stint as an intelligence analyst on the ground in Afghanistan, in Kabul and Kandahar. He previously worked as an associate political scientist for the RAND Corporation, and in that capacity he served in Iraq as an analyst and advisor to the multinational force in Iraq and the U.S. military. His most recent book is entitled Deterrence from Cold War to Long War, Lessons from 6 Decades of RAND Research, and that was published by RAND in 2008.
I don't really have a PowerPoint. I have a picture and a map, so you guys can move or not as you. I might blind you with the laser. As Stuart and Kim talked about, I think September 11th had a profound effect on everyone, me no less than anyone. On September 11th, 2001, as a not really very reconstructed meathead, I was sparring at a gym in Atlanta that morning. My sparring partner and I took a break, walked over to where the TVs were. There was reports that a plane had hit one of the World Trade Centers. As Stuart sort of indicated, my initial reaction was similar. You know, planes have hit big buildings in New York again. It's probably a light plane, no big deal. So we're sort of sitting there chatting and sweating as the second plane hits. And that was a pretty emotional moment, I think, for everybody. And then if you fast forward a few years to now, I've spent about a third of the past 4 years in some combination of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And that you know, have no fear, that would not have been the case had September 11th not happened. So a profound impact on me in terms of my career, where I've been, what I've done. So that brings us to the picture, a little show with the tell. This is a view from a Special Forces compound in southern Afghanistan, taken this past July. Had a not so great day there. Outpost of Progress as the caption. For those of you that read Joseph Conrad, you'll note the somewhat ironic nature of that caption. There is progress there, but perhaps not as much as we would like, and in many ways not the kind of progress we would like. So I'm going to talk today about Afghanistan and the war on terror. I should note that I'm speaking only for myself and for no other entity that has ever employed me, however foolishly, to do any work on this. And I'm not really going to talk in detail about the specifics I was up to in Afghanistan this past summer. So general map of the region. It's kind of a busy map. Why are we in Afghanistan? The current administration has identified 2 main reasons. So I'm going to talk to the threats that get us into Afghanistan and its region. I'm going to talk to the problems we face in Afghanistan, and I'm going to talk to some of the options for dealing with those problems. I say options because I don't really think there are solutions. So what are the threats? The 2 identified threats, first and foremost, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda continues to exist both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. In areas right here, Pakistan, and then up here, parts of Afghanistan like Nuristan. Not so much down here in the south, but there is some, and not really substantial presence down here in Balochistan, part of Pakistan. So that's one interest driving the U.S. presence is the ability to prevent Al-Qaeda from having safe havens of the kind they enjoyed before 2001. The second is the security and safety of Pakistani nuclear weapons and nuclear material. Apparently, they want to get me on record, no matter how far away from the mic I get. While there is a real threat of sanctuary, however modest, and maybe in Q&A we can talk about what the real threat of sanctuary is of Al-Qaeda, it is a real threat. I think the idea that the United States is in Afghanistan to protect Pakistan's nuclear material borders on farcical. There's this notion that somehow if the Afghan Taliban, that I'll talk about in a minute, take over some or all of Afghanistan, that somehow Pakistan will become the next domino to fall. I think this is even less credible than the domino theory in Southeast Asia some 50 years ago. As I'll talk to, the folks we're fighting in Afghanistan are distinct from the folks that the Pakistanis are fighting and are in fact supported by the Pakistani state, at a minimum tacitly, and there's pretty good evidence explicitly. So Pakistan's nuclear material, to the extent that it's at risk, is not at risk from things that happen in Afghanistan. It is at risk. It's at risk due to things happening inside Pakistan. And that's a real concern that the United States should take very seriously. It's one that has to be dealt with inside Pakistan. We could put 100,000, 1 million, however many troops we want to put in Afghanistan. It is not going to make the risk that someone at the Gakuda Research Lab in Pakistan will smuggle some nuclear material out any less likely. This notion that somehow having a sanctuary inside Afghanistan will enable various extremist groups to mount some sort of major offensive against a Pakistani military base and steal a nuclear weapon is completely incredible. If the threat is real, it comes from within Pakistan. So that's just my take on the two different threats we face, and that will sort of color the diagnosis of options later. So let's talk about the problems we face in Afghanistan in attempting to deal with these two problems. There's three interlocking layers of problems. The first is regional, the second are sort of country or state level, and the third are local. And these all tie in together to make one hell of a mess. So what are the regional problems? In addition to U.S. interests, there are four major players in Afghanistan and the border region of Pakistan. They are Pakistan, India, Iran, and Russia. And I'm not really going to talk to Russia. I think Alex did a great job of that, other than to say that the United States is increasingly relying on what's called the Northern Distribution Network to bring supplies into Afghanistan, and that network runs straight through Russia. So in reducing reliance on Pakistan as a source of logistics, the United States has increased reliance on Russia. So it's a sort of pick your poison. Someone is going to have leverage over you, and the United States has increasingly decided they would rather have Russia have leverage than Pakistan. So what about the other three? Pakistan is, let's not kid ourselves, pursuing its own strategic interests, which are only partly coterminous with those of the United States. Pakistan has no real great friendship to al-Qaeda. Rumors to the contrary. I don't really believe that the Pakistani state was actively harboring Osama bin Laden. I say that having been to Abbottabad about a year before Osama bin Laden was killed there. So they're not great friends of al-Qaeda. However, they do rely and have a history of relying heavily on Islamic extremists as proxies in their wars with India and also in their attempts to control what's going on in Afghanistan. That hasn't changed. They continue to support the different groups, which I'll talk to in a moment, in terms of their goals inside Afghanistan. So you have to distinguish first and foremost between AQ, al-Qaeda, and these other groups. And Pakistan has a real interest in supporting them. So they play a double game. They will support the United States in some issues, particularly dealing with al-Qaeda, in exchange for all the various forms of aid the United States provides. At the same time, they essentially continue to sponsor and support and give sanctuary to the folks that we're fighting against in Afghanistan. So that's a very serious problem, as you can imagine. The analogy that's been made to me by one military officer was, imagine if we had tried to be allies with North Vietnam during the Vietnam War as we were fighting in South Vietnam. It's deeply challenging to avoid using the kind of salty language I was using this summer. Second, India. A lot of Pakistan's interest in Afghanistan is driven by its perception of Indian influence there. They're always going to have an influence just based, or an interest in Afghanistan just based on the geographical proximity and the fact that many Afghans consider this part of Pakistan to really belong to Afghanistan. So there's always going to be a Pakistani interest. But Indian activities inside Afghanistan have really amped them up. And in fact, they claim various Indian consulates are really a vehicle for Indian intelligence activities, sponsoring the Baluch insurgency down here, and various other nefarious activities. And you can't always believe the Pakistanis when they claim that India is up to no good, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that there's no evidence they're not after you. And India is up to certain things inside Afghanistan, though it's a little opaque to what extent. So India plays a non-trivial role here, and I'll note, as I'll talk about in a minute, the civil war in the 1990s, India actively supported the Northern Alliance inside that war. Third, Iran. Iran plays a role in supporting the insurgency, not really because it has any ideological affinity towards it. In fact, the Taliban regime that the United States overthrew was actually pretty hostile and nearly came to war with Iran before 2001. But Iran is a big believer in the whole the enemy of my enemy is my friend thing, and is willing to provide at least low levels of support to the Taliban inside Afghanistan. And then finally, as I mentioned, Russia. So we have this regional witch's brew going on. If you move one level of analysis down to the state level, the United States did intervene in a civil war between essentially a northern alliance consisting of Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras against a Taliban regime that was almost exclusively Pashtun. We, the United States, have sort of pretended that that went away, that civil war ended when we decisively gave victory to one side, and that now what's going on is a war between a state and a rebel group. And my argument is that's not really true. We are still fundamentally in the midst of a civil war. The insurgency we are fighting inside Afghanistan is almost wholly a Pashtun phenomenon. There are small, as I'll talk to in a minute, small elements of Uzbeks that are involved for religious reasons, but by and large, you can find the insurgency in Afghanistan wherever three Pashtuns can walk together unmolested. Where that's not true, you don't really have much of an insurgency. So we're in the midst of a civil war, and because we've confused ourselves on the diagnosis of this problem, to some extent we've confused ourselves on the solution. Then finally, you have the local level dynamics. Even at the level of the district, for example, the district in the picture I showed earlier, which is almost all Pashtun with a small Hazara community, you have tribal factions, you have different power broker factions, etc. So even within the Pashtun community, you don't have homogenous interest in either supporting or fighting against the United States. Some Pashtuns, for various reasons, including good old filthy lucre, are strong supporters of the United States. Many are not. So you have that level of dynamics that makes the situation even more complicated. So I'll talk briefly about the groups we're dealing with, the problem of the Afghan government, and then move on to options and conclude. So as I mentioned, you have to distinguish between al-Qaeda and the various other groups. The main way to distinguish these groups is what their goals are. Al-Qaeda has transnational, expansive goals, whether it's actually the establishment of a caliphate or just getting the United States out of Islamic countries is open to question, but the point is it does have transnational goals. The other groups that we look at inside the Afghan insurgency are primarily interested in local causes. So there's three principal groups. The first is Hizb Islami Gulbuddin. This is an organization that's been around since the 1980s. The United States actually supported it against the Soviets. It's less important than it was at one time, but it's still prominent, particularly in areas up here. This is mostly Tajik, Uzbek country, but there are pockets of Pashtuns up there, and so that's where a lot of their support is. There's the Quetta Shura Taliban. This is the sort of reconstituted Taliban government that the United States overthrew in 2001. Its principal strongholds are in Kandahar, Helmand, and then, of course, across the border here in Quetta, hence the name Quetta Shura, and then on down into Karachi. Some people even argue it should be renamed the Karachi Shura Taliban because their presence there is so great now. The third group is the Haqqani Network. This is probably the most lethal organization in Afghanistan, and it's the one probably most closely tied to Pakistani intelligence. Its stronghold is what they call Loya Paktia, this region of Paktia, Paktika, and Host province over here, and then across the border here in the federally administered tribal areas. There's actually no evidence that indicates the Haqqani Network has much interest beyond this part of Afghanistan, much less of a transnational nature, despite having much of the same religious ideology as Al-Qaeda. So I think in the same way that you could distinguish between flavors of communists during the Cold War, you similarly have to distinguish between flavors of Islamists now. The analogy might be the difference between world revolution of Trotsky and socialism in one country. The Haqqani Network is definitely a sort of Islamism in one country, or even Islamism in one little subpart of a country. And then finally, there are a few other groups. I won't really talk about the Pakistani Taliban, other than to say that the distinction is the Pakistani Taliban's interests are all aimed here inside Pakistan and are against the Pakistani state primarily, and don't really have support from the Pakistani state, obviously, because they're fighting against it. There's also the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan that Alex alluded to. That's really the only Uzbek component of the insurgency, and they're a lot closer to al-Qaeda in their sort of worldview than they are to, say, the Haqqani Network. An additional problem we face is the Afghan government. I won't belabor the point on corruption. I think people are aware of it. I will say that in condemning corruption full stop, I think the United States misses a little bit of the point. The issue is about how resources get divided. And we have a hang-up in this country about it being done informally, but this is a fairly common thing, that patronage networks informally distribute resources. Here in New York, we infamously had a good century of that. In Chicago, I think that's still going on, though maybe it's changing. And the issue is not so much how the resources get distributed, but to whom they get distributed. And the problem in Afghanistan is you don't have very many what I would call good mafioso. A good mafioso knows it's easier to give somebody a little taste of the revenues than it is to fight them. And I think for sort of shadow of the future reasons that we can talk about in Q&A, most mafioso in Afghanistan want to put as much money in their pocket as possible rather than distributing it broadly. In areas where you see power brokers or warlords or whatever term of art you want to use distribute resources more broadly, you have fewer problems. And I'll highlight a particularly nasty guy down here who is now the chief of police, Brigadier General Abdul Razik, who is not a very nice guy, but he's pretty good at distributing resources, and he's managed to keep the Spin Boldak region right here at the border relatively secure. I mean, this should be one of the least secure places in Afghanistan because it's right across the border from the stronghold of the Quetta Shura in their home province. And yet it's relatively secure in part because he's been a good mafioso. So just, in thinking about corruption, I would highlight that there's maybe not good and bad corruption, but there's functional and dysfunctional corruption. And the problem in Afghanistan is there's a lot of dysfunctional corruption. So I'll conclude by talking about what the U.S. options are. First, I'll highlight what the current plan is. The United States is drawing down, even as we speak, with the goal of reaching 68,000 troops from the current roughly 100,000 by the end of 2012. This will be followed by an additional drawdown to a minimal number. I mean, the headline number is 0, but 0 never means 0, by the end of 2014. So that's the current plan. Clearly, through 2012, the current administration will have say, so I have high confidence we'll get to that number. But as you're all aware, we have an election intervening there, and I think the next administration and the next Congress and their attitudes will have a profound impact on where we actually are in 2014. So what are our options? Well, one option that has been bruited quite a lot is reconciliation, essentially a negotiated settlement with the Taliban. President Karzai in Afghanistan has actually called the Taliban his brothers and sort of offered them to come to the table, et cetera, et cetera. I won't say it's impossible, but I think it borders on a pipe dream, at least as things currently stand. There are two reasons for this. One is simply the number of players that have to be satisfied by any set of negotiations and what I think is a fairly small Venn diagram overlap between their interests. So the four minimal players are the United States, Pakistan, the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban, and the former Northern Alliance network. In other words, the Tajik, Uzbeks, and Hazaras that the United States relied on to overthrow the Taliban regime. I think the ability to find an acceptable compromise on a future of Afghanistan between these groups is vanishingly small. The second is, from the Taliban's perspective, you could either take a slice of the pie now, or they have access to CNN and Al Jazeera just like the rest of us, hang tough for another 3 years and potentially get all the pie. And I think that shadow of the future weighs pretty heavily on Taliban and also Pakistani calculations. If you think the United States is really not going to stick around, you can take everything down the road. And in fact, even if you do come to the table, I think it will be a sort of, again, to draw that Southeast Asia analogy, it will be a temporary pause that will allow them to refresh before final victory. All right, so that's not working. The United States could leave entirely. Just actually follow the plan. 0 actually means 0. Bug out. I think that's problematic as well. There are al-Qaeda here. I mean, for reals. Not that many, but hundreds. And it doesn't, al-Qaeda is not a divisional organization. They don't need 10,000 men under arms to conduct attacks. And the United States presence in Afghanistan doesn't just enable direct action. These blue circles, by the way, are the radius of an unrefueled combat helicopter if you wanted to conduct an operation. You will note, perhaps uncoincidentally, that this extends deep into Pakistan, including to Abbottabad over there. So the United States not only can conduct direct action from Afghanistan, but it's crucial for intelligence collection. You don't have to have many troops on the ground to collect intelligence, but you can't have zero. That's true for both technical intelligence of most kinds and for human intelligence. So I think leaving entirely is not a good option. As Professor Betts started from, sometimes you can overreact, sometimes you can underreact. You want that Goldilocks solution, which I argue is to retain a fairly small but non-trivial enduring presence in Afghanistan post-2014. And in Q&A, we can talk about numbers, but I think that the numbers are not tiny. They're not going to be 1,000, but neither do they have to be 30, 40, 50,000. I think somewhere between, depending on how ambitious your goals are about the structure of the Afghan state, somewhere between 6 and about 25,000, depending on what you, how ambitious your goals are, would be sufficient. And so I'll stop there and we can get to Q&A.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, so how we'd like to run things from here is, before we open it up to audience questions, I'd like to run down the panel in the order they presented and give everyone 3 or 4 minutes to add a comment, ask a question of another panelist. There's already been a little bit of crosstalk, or just add whatever you'd like. And while we're doing that, the audience can start lining up at the microphone. So we'll take questions only at the microphone up here. If you're going to ask a question, we'd like you to first introduce yourself, and we'd also like to encourage short questions and make sure what you'd like to say is actually a question. So I'll reserve the right to kind of intervene and focus speakers if they seem to be kind of going on and in an editorial kind of fashion. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks. I thought that was a bunch of great presentations. I learned a lot, and I agree with much of what was said, and I think it added to my understanding of terrorism. That being said, I disagree with some things that were said today respectfully. One issue, let me just push back on just for a minute, is the temptation to disassociate centralized al-Qaeda, which I think is more than just a few hundred individuals, as Austin pointed out, mostly in Afghan-Pakistan border, which is also an ideology that is inspirational, and it connects to affiliated groups and individuals around the world. And I think there's a temptation in political science to try to look at the trees and understand some of the micro issues related to al-Qaeda and some of its affiliated organizations and its actions. But I think we have to be mindful of the interconnections and the way that the threads weave through a lot of these different players, not just in Central Asia, but around the world. I agree with much of what Austin said. His description of the different groups in the region in Central Asia, they do have different motivations, and they may one day even separate from each other further. But I think that they're more interconnected than was made out by Austin and a few other folks that spoke about the nature of al-Qaeda. Let me give you, Austin, one quote from Secretary Gates from last year. He was pushing back on the Pakistanis a little bit, who were saying that some of the groups that they're supporting are a little bit less dangerous than others. And Gates pushed back, and he said, dividing these individual extremist groups into individual pockets, if you will, is, in my view, a mistaken way to look at the challenge we all face. He went on to say, al-Qaeda, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Tariqi Taliban in Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Haqqani Network. This is a syndicate of terrorists that work together. And when one succeeds, they all benefit, and they share ideas, they share planning. They don't operationally coordinate their activities, as best as I can tell, but they're in close contact. They take inspiration from one another. They take ideas from one another, unquote. I would agree with that, and I'm sure Austin would agree with much of that in Central Asia. But I would also agree with much of that with groups that are not directly linked with the current conflict in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Of the 43 terrorist organizations, designated terrorist organizations in the State Department annual list, 25 of them are Islamist terrorist organizations. I don't know if that affects Paige, some of the stuff you said, but 25 of the 43 of the U.S. State Department list are Islamist terrorist groups, and just a cursory back of the envelope look at this would say at least 3/4 of those are in some ways interconnected by some strings, whether it's through affiliates of affiliates or even just a common ideology where they get inspired, as Gates said, from one another. So I think that my final point is, because I want to say something about what Kim brought up also, is there's this temptation to look locally, and I think that that's a good research path, and to start thinking locally rather than globally and seeing what are the motivations of some of these groups. But I think Spain, which is one of the examples you brought up where there was a quote-unquote, I don't know if you call it successful or the terrorism seemed to work, in the sense that the Madrid bombings did get Spain to withdraw within just a few months all of their troops from Iraq, which was one of the goals of the Madrid bombing in March of 2004. So unfortunately, some political scientists, Robert Pape, others, would look at that as an example of a success because of a foreign intervention and to get foreign occupiers out of a foreign land and bring them home. But it's more complicated than that. What is often not reported, and what many people actually don't know because it was not a successful attack, was 8 months after the Madrid bombings in March of 2004, there was a second attack planned with about 23 individuals from North Africa, a few Pakistanis, and some from Spain itself, with another plot. And this was after the troops were withdrawn from Iraq, and that plot was to blow up a Tosha station again and a variety of other symbols and a skyscraper, Real Madrid soccer stadium during a soccer match. Simultaneous attack, the way Al-Qaeda likes to do them. And that attack was disrupted. But the point I'm making is, yes, there was a local feeling to withdraw Spanish troops from Iraq along the lines of Pape. But the bigger goals of the jihadi groups in that particular case was not about Iraq, and it wasn't even about Afghanistan, where Spain had a few troops. It was the fact that they think that Spain is part of the original caliphate, and they're going to keep attacking Spain, these groups and these networks of groups, until Spain gets back to its place in the 13th century, southern Spain, Andalusia. And that's a much bigger goal, and Robert Pape does not account for these global goals, although a lot of people do die and a lot of plots are planned according to this global ideology, and these are strings of networks that connect around the world. Final point on Saltzman. I have 1 minute left. I like Mark Saltzman. He wrote a nice review of my book, so I don't want to say anything too bad about him. However, the idea that it's mostly just small self-starters or miscreants that are the big problem, I don't disagree that that is a problem. Where I do disagree is that these individuals are only radicalized over the internet and in their living rooms. We are unfortunately seeing, as centralized Al-Qaeda diminishes, the rise of affiliated groups which do have space to operate, unfortunately, in places like East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and North Africa. We have to be vigilant and keep up some of the efforts. I think Austin presented them correctly in Central Asia, what we need to do offshore counterterrorism along the lines of what some of the things I discussed. But we shouldn't discount the threat as just being individuals at this point. There are affiliates, and these affiliates are now competing in some ways to see which will replace possibly a centralized Al-Qaeda and be sort of the new vanguard of what they see as a global revolution, which I don't believe will ever succeed, but it doesn't matter what I believe, it matters what they believe. And,
Thanks. All right, Professor Martin.
Poor Austin. I'm going to take him on too.
Bring it.
2 comments.
Duck.
First of all, I think that Austin is too dismissive of the benefit of having some presence in Afghanistan for the nuclear situation in Pakistan, and that's because the intelligence that U.S. forces are getting in Afghanistan is not limited to the immediate war. It's also intelligence about what's happening in Pakistan, and that actually having a military presence on the ground that is trying to make the state more stable and therefore make it more comfortable for a small U.S. military presence to stay over the long term is something that probably contributes to the long-term interest of keeping an eye on what's happening in Pakistan. So I think the two are more connected than maybe Austin's presentation was highlighting. But the second thing I really want to take on about what Austin said was the idea that patronage and warlords can be a good thing. And I have two comments here. This is the theme of my book, by the way, so it's something I care about passionately. And I think what Austin is bringing up, but maybe not putting in the entire context, is the difference between short-term and long-term thinking about security effects. Austin's absolutely correct that in the short term, when we're concerned about immediate security interests, working through patronage networks with people like warlords and other power brokers can be absolutely necessary for U.S. security goals. There's no question that that's true. But there's also no question that in the long term, patronage is really detrimental to U.S. security goals and the goals of the rest of the world, including of local actors. And that's basically for a couple of reasons. One is that by definition, patronage is really unstable. If one person is the person that you're relying on for all of your security needs and that person gets assassinated, all of a sudden everything is up for grabs. Patronage is by definition not institutionalized. It's something that relies on personal connections rather than something that relies on institutionalized laws and rules with rules for secession. And that's something that actually distinguishes patronage in Afghanistan from, for example, the American mafia, where there are some rules for secession in place. A lot of people believe that one of the reasons that Mexico is in such tough shape at the moment is that they are now attacking people, assassinating people, jailing people. There are no rules for secession, and so everybody's competing over the spoils, and that's where the violence is coming from. The second is that patronage, by definition, excludes some people. You can't have patronage if you give to everybody. You have to only give to the people who agree to support you. And in many of the cases in Afghanistan, as Austin well knows, patronage is defined by ethnic networks, it's defined by various kinds of clan networks, and that means there are people who are excluded. Why does that matter? Because all of the evidence indicates that political violence and terrorism are caused by people who are facing political inequality and a sense of lack of political opportunity. And so that means that over the long term, patronage is something that may very well lead to increased levels of violence because the people who are not included in the patronage networks feel excluded. And I think there's evidence that that is one of the reasons for support of the Taliban in the Pakistani tribal areas. And so we can talk about that in more depth. So there's this real sense of unease here. How do you get your short-term security interests met when over the long term, getting those security interests met may actually undermine your security? And I don't have an answer, but I think that's the framework that it should be put into. One more comment, just when we're thinking about patronage, I think there's a real danger in saying, this is the way things are done in these societies, and so therefore that's how we have to act too. It's the culture. I can tell you from my research that culture, quote unquote, was very significantly influenced by imperialism over the past century and a half, which really disrupted the indigenous cultural networks. And so what we're seeing now is not this long-standing, indigenous tribalism that's always been there and we have to play by the tribal rules. What we're seeing is tribalism that was very much distorted by external actors deciding to work through patronage networks with warlords and elevating them in a way that didn't fit what the traditional cultures meant. So I'll stop there.
Great. Professor Fortna?
Thanks. Disrupt the floral arrangement of the microwave. Hold on. There we go. Okay, a couple of things in response. First, in response to Stuart's comment just now about the FTO State Department list, I think that list is extremely problematic to use for any empirical research. It's, first of all, if you look closely at the State Department definition of terrorism, it's basically the use of violence, the illegal use of violence. Anything that is violent and threatening could be put under that. And then there's the second piece of it that harms or threatens us or our friends. So it's very politicized, it's very subjective. So to use that list as kind of your list of organizations doesn't surprise me that that list has a high proportion of Islamic groups. That's who we think our enemies are, right? I have a question for Austin. The strategy that you propose as maybe the least bad option going forward in Afghanistan of leaving 6,000 to 25,000 troops, can you say a little bit about what that means in terms of the shadow of the future, the thinking of the Taliban and other groups now about if that's what's going to happen, how are they going to react to that? Does that allow them then to get the whole pie? We have a much reduced presence, and so they can then fight us more effectively, and out we go. It's just a little bit bloodier than if we go down to 0. Or is that actually going to deter that? In terms of sort of thinking about whether they're going to get a part of the pie or the whole pie, and when that might happen. And then, and just sort of general kind of, not quite debate, but kind of out there about how negotiable are the aims of Al-Qaeda? Is this a group with sort of total goal, the establishment of the caliphate and the global network, and these, it's very extreme, and there's no way of negotiating with that? Wouldn't necessarily contest that, but I would just put it in perspective by saying those on the receiving end of terrorism always think that about the group that is attacking them, and there are cases where groups end up negotiating a deal. So you shouldn't necessarily take people's first opening bid in terms of their statement of political goals as the only thing that they would ever accept. So I'll stop there.
Professor Cooley?
Yeah, thanks. This is really, really rich and really stimulating. Paige took my response to this issue of blacklisting. I think it's important to sort of view the process of blacklisting as an inherently political one. And to just contextualize it. Yes, it can be used for some, as some indications, but the way the sausage is made, if you look at the deals that are done and the trade-offs and so forth, says a lot more about coalition building dynamics, I think, than sort of objective indicators of who's a terrorist or not. Just a very minor point, because this doesn't have anything to do with the presentations, but I think it's important for the historical record. On the whole business of Spain in 2004, let's not forget why Aznar lost this election. He lost this election because he went to bat very publicly and said this was the work of ETA as soon as the bombings unfolded. He called up every major newspaper and gave them his word that he knew for a fact that this was the work of ETA. So it is not surprising at all that he was punished at the polls for this, right? So before we get into sort of the Spanish, I'm not saying anyone on this panel was saying this, but there was this meme that somehow the Spanish were appeasing terrorists and Al-Qaeda and so forth. The domestic political context, I think, was pretty compelling in terms of an anti-Aznar backlash. And Zapatero, yes, withdrew troops from Iraq. It was in his campaign platform, but he also preserved basing rights for OIF, unlike, say, the lack of Spanish support for things like Libya in 1986 or so forth. So this wasn't a complete withdrawal from coalition. It was a withdrawal of actual Spanish forces. Just one other brief point following on some of Austin's presentation. It's become very fashionable, especially amongst the Obama administration, now to talk about the need for a regional solution in Afghanistan. And we're going to convene a big conference in Chicago, NATO is, in the spring, to sort of talk about the contours of this. And just some of the background that Austin gave, I think, shows how difficult, in fact, putting together a regional solution is going to be, not only because countries have different sort of preferences and agendas, but there are at least 2 countries that border Afghanistan that don't really want to see a stable, functioning Afghanistan in some ways, or certain elements don't. And Pakistan is one. Tajikistan is the other. Tajikistan benefits inordinately from the drug trade. This is this double drug trade from Afghanistan doubles its GDP. The idea that somehow the Tajik government would ever be on board some sort of real serious international sort of counter narcotics effort is debatable. So, regional solutions, this sounds really good, and you would think everyone has an interest in sort of a stable Afghanistan, but in practice, it's going to be really incredibly difficult. Plus, I'll give you one more analogy in terms of the diplomatic legwork here. Remember the Madrid conference after the Gulf War, right? And attempts to finally have Arabs and Israelis down to the settlement table and so forth. James Baker back then made dozens of trips to Syria, to Saudi Arabia. I mean, he was tireless. I mean, never thought he'd be sort of extolling the virtues of Jim Baker in preparing the groundwork for this, right? And so I don't see nearly the same level of shuttling of engagement. It's just more put out there as an aspiration, really, than an actual sort of concrete plan. But that's a complete gratuitous aside that I think was inspired by some of Austin's point on the regional situation.
Okay, Professor Long.
Fortunately, I like to fight. But first, nice things about my fellow panelists. Cam, I thought that was a great overview. I mean, even though I engage with a lot of that literature too, I hope this comes out as maybe a review essay or something. I mean, it's just really great overview of where social science has come in the decade. Same thing with Alex. You know, I'm not nearly as deep on a lot of these issues as you are, but I learned a lot just from that presentation. And I thought really the most interesting piece was Paige's. That was some really fascinating findings. You know, even from somebody that looks a lot at civil war and insurgency to sort of find those conclusions. That was great. All right, now on to the festivities. So, Stuart, you know, I'm sorry that I'm not properly deferential to Secretary Gates. Bob Jervis would probably say that if I disagree with Bob Gates, I'm actually probably right, just based on that as the sole indicator. I think, you know, 60 years ago, you know, you might have been saying the same thing. A communist is a communist is a communist. Well, they weren't. With Sino-Soviet split, I mean, ad nauseum. The same is true of these groups. Yes, they share an ideology. That does not mean they're indistinguishable. Yes, they will share techniques. They will share a variety of things, but their goals are different. There have been 0 Haqqani Network attacks inside Pakistan. There have been 0 Haqqani Network attacks inside the United States. There have been 0 Haqqani Network attacks anywhere really but Afghanistan. Is that because the Haqqani Network is incapable? No, it's extraordinarily capable. But that doesn't mean that somehow they're indistinguishable from Al-Qaeda. So I take your point that you have to take the ideology seriously, but if you're going to fight every Islamic extremist with a gun, you know, buckle down, kids, because we're in for a rough ride. I mean, there are a lot of Islamic extremists. They are not all inherently major national security risks to the United States. Hezbollah right now, you know, could potentially be a major opponent of the United States. They have, by and large, chosen not to be. I mean, they oppose some of our regional interests and will occasionally poke us in the eye, but Hezbollah has not attempted to launch attacks on the U.S. homeland. So to conflate all, even Sunni extremists, I think is looking for more enemies than we need to. And I say that as somebody who, you know, attempts have been made on my life by at least 4 different Islamic extremist groups, all for very different, if somewhat related reasons. Kim, dismissive of benefits of being in Afghanistan for Pakistan nukes. I think there's some benefit. Clearly, I do believe the United States should retain some presence in Afghanistan, but you know, even at the unclassified New York Times level, you know, Raymond Davis, the former Special Forces, later CIA contractor that was arrested in Lahore, I mean, he was based at the consulate there. I mean, we have an active intelligence collection effort inside Pakistan, and you're going to have a much easier time figuring out what's going on at Qahuda from Islamabad or Lahore or Karachi than you are from Jalalabad or Bagram. So while I think that, you know, there is some goodness there, the majority of our collection against Pakistan is going to come from inside Pakistan. On the corruption patronage issue, I think this just reflects our different sort of viewpoints on what the U.S. interest in Afghanistan is/are. I totally concede that in the long term, if you're really concerned about building a sort of Weberian state that will provide security, you know, patronage is not your friend. I mean, we came out of the Tammany Hall systems for a reason. I just don't really care that much about stability in Afghanistan, except as it relates to those 2 goals that were laid out. And I believe the United States can achieve those goals. Yes, patronage is unstable, but you can always find a new patron. Yes, people will be excluded, but you just have to find enough partners to ensure that the situation is, you know, shall we say, meta-stable, right? You don't have to make everyone happy. You just have to make enough people happy to keep the others in line. If this is a remarkably cold-blooded view of the world, you know, it comes from someone who has seen the cost in blood and treasure to the United States of actions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I would rather work through warlords knowing the cost of that than the alternative. And amplifying that, you mentioned culture and imperialism. I mean, I take your point. There's nothing inherent in any of these cultures, in either Iraq or Afghanistan, that means they're doomed to this system. But the thing to remember about Afghanistan is it's a rentier state, right? All of its resources come from outside the state itself. In most rentier states, it's from natural resources. In Afghanistan, it is from us. In rural Afghanistan, there is no tax collection. Therefore, if there is no external aid budget, there is no government. So we are inherently, in some sense, in the business of patronage just because there is no alternative. And I would rather we just sort of own up to that and try and move towards functional patronage rather than dysfunctional patronage. Because you're right, a lot of this is driven by the unwillingness to share the wealth. And as you're right, sharing the wealth doesn't mean everybody gets some, but prominent players are excluded. And that's a real problem. So we have to expand the patronage networks at least sufficiently to ensure that that those that are important get a taste in a way that they currently aren't. Page strategy. In terms of shadow of the future, I think it actually helps if you can say to the Taliban and various affiliated groups, hey, the United States is going to be here as long as it takes. We'll be in less presence, but we're not going away. Because right now the expectation is, I know 0 is not 0, but everybody else doesn't, right? They believe 0 is actually 0. And who knows, depending on the elections and the economy, 0 really could be 0. I think that would be bad, as I outlined. But what happens if we go to this smaller footprint? We're going to probably lose most of the Pashtun areas. But remember, we intervened in support of one side in a civil war that held 10% of the country and rapidly gave them all of the country. That group still exists in one form or another and is still armed in one form or another. And in fact, they make up a lot of the Afghan military. So if the civil war becomes completely apparent to the naked eye, I think we can easily ensure that at least 60% of the country, which perhaps not coincidentally is the non-Pashtun part of the population, can be held. And we can achieve the goals in terms of Al-Qaeda and also the goals in terms of Pakistan with that 60%. Now, the advantage you get from the shadow of the future is if you can say credibly, look, we're not going to have 100,000 guys here, but we're going to have 5,000 guys, 10,000 guys, 15,000 guys, and they're all going to be beating you about the head and shoulders and providing air support and medevac and all this to a still capable Afghan military and conducting counterterrorism operations, then maybe, and by the way, because we've reduced our footprint, we can now do this indefinitely, right? How many people know how many troops are in Iraq right now? Raise your hand. Yeah, this is my point. Bob Jervis knows because he knows everything. But other than, well, okay. Nobody else knows. Why? Is it because the number is 0? No, the number is still about 40,000, actually closer to 50. Why don't we know that? Because it's off the front page. And as long as you get the numbers in Afghanistan off the front page, we can do this forever. I think that does start to change people's calculations. Thank you.
Great. All right, so we'd like to invite people up for questions. Okay. So again, please introduce yourself.
Oh, yes. Since the United States has...
Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Beg pardon?
Can you introduce yourself, please? Tell us who you are.
Oh, yeah. Bill Harris. I'm an alumnus.
Okay.
Not of this school, yeah, one of the others here. Yes, since the United States now has reinstated realism as its dominant, policy activities in foreign policy, what effect will this have on, the United States leaving Afghanistan, since, the basic conflict is the civil war?
You take them one at a time, or you want to gather?
We do. Let's gather maybe 3 at a time, and then we'll kind of distribute them and do another round. That sounds like a good idea. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Abe Wagner. I'm a faculty member here at CEPA. I'm a good friend of most of all of you. And Austin, we've had the discussion about Afghanistan ad nauseum, and I simply don't believe that the objectives you've set forth are, achievable at all. But that's not the actual question I want to ask. What I would like to draw you out on is, what do you think about the decision-making process within the Taliban? How does it really function? I mean, you talked a little bit about it in your talk about what they're likely to do and objectives, but what do we really understand about the nature of that decision process and how it's likely to evolve in the future?
Okay, I'll take one more.
Hi, I'm Leanne Chung. I'm a graduate of the Columbia Engineering School about 20 years ago. And I happen to be from Sarasota, Florida, where President Bush was on 9/11 with school children, and it's the same county where the lead terrorist attacker, Mohammed Atta, trained in flight school. So I was wondering if any of you panelists know if there's been any intelligence gathering on counterterrorism regarding Sarasota, Florida, or has there been any study regarding how the lives of terrorists, their day-to-day operations were. Over the past 10 years, I've learned where Mohammed Atta allegedly worked, where he bought fish with his cousin, where he shopped at Home Depot. I was just wondering if Sarasota has been in the limelight with any counterterrorism studies. Thank you.
Okay. So, any volunteers to take it?
I could answer that for half a second, not necessarily about Sarasota, Florida, but the 9/11 commissioners, not everything that made into the final report, but they did pretty in-depth analyses of these different actors. There's a few other books out there I could talk to you after that go through all of the different players of 9/11, and not just in the days and weeks before the attack, but how they came into the country, what they were doing, why they were in Florida.
Like Andrew Card, things like that.
Why Andrew Card was in Florida?
He was there with the president.
Well, he was the chief, yeah, he was the chief of staff. They were going somewhere else. They had a bunch of events that he was with them on Air Force One. But in terms of why Otto was there, and maybe why counterterrorism wasn't, would be explained in the 9/11 Commission report, or at least it goes into some of that stuff.
I don't know anything about Sarasota, Florida, but I'm originally from Minnesota, and one of the striking things that's been happening there is the Shabab that's fighting in Somalia, including terrorist attacks against civilians. Young Somalis who emigrated to the United States are now going back, and they're coming out of Minnesota. So the whole question of what is happening in the United States that is creating a situation that causes people to want to commit acts of terrorism, I think, is still very relevant. I just wanted to quickly say one thing in regard to what Austin said, because we'll keep on debating this. But off the top of my head, I can think of 3 cases where U.S. security interests have been harmed by our previous support of patronage. One is Egypt, where the Egyptian military played a very positive role in the Arab Spring, but now there is a great concern about whether one of our strongest allies in the Middle East is going to be undercut by the fact that the population really resents the patronage that is practiced by the Egyptian military, and that they might blame the United States for that. The second is a case that Alex Cooley has done a lot of work on, and that's the Kyrgyzstan case in 2010, when there was an overthrow of the existing government. One of the big issues was resentment over the patronage that was practiced by the U.S. military base located in Manas, which is crucial for our operations in Afghanistan. And the third is that there's a lot of evidence that the kinds of violence that's now occurring in Iraq again includes violence among members of the Sons of Iraq and their followers who are disagreeing about the distribution of the spoils now that the United States is no longer there to really play any role in dampening down their conflicts. So I think we can't ignore long-term interests that the U.S. has in security, even if we have to focus on these short-term interests too.
Okay, sure. The return of realism to the U.S. foreign policy is a consummation devoutly to be wished, but I don't think we're quite there yet. The intervention in Libya, we sort of tried to keep our hands off of it, but we were certainly hanging out in the background. As I alluded to, our strategy in Afghanistan is still a bit confused about what we're actually up to. So I think we might have become somewhat more realistic, but I would not say we have embraced a fully realist foreign policy. But that's okay. We're America. We can get by with mixing a little idealism here, realism here. What are the implications for withdrawal from Afghanistan? Look, we're going to continue to support the Afghan state. And there are Pashtun elements to it. There are Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara elements to it. At a minimum, we'll hold the parts that are non-Pashtun. But look, even Pashtuns, there's plenty of Pashtun supporters of the United States. principally for reasons of patronage, but that's sort of how it works in a lot of these cases. Taliban decision making. As I said, there's a lot of groups, but one thing to bear in mind, despite in some sense our best efforts targeting Taliban mid-level leadership, it's the different groups are still pretty coherent. There is an inner shura of the Quetta Shura Taliban that makes decisions. Now, are they implemented with absolute fidelity on the ground everywhere in Afghanistan? No, but they do have a lot of say. Now, there's infighting, it happens, but it's pretty minimal. The Haqqani Network, as far as I could tell, is extraordinarily disciplined. And I think as soon as Siraj Haqqani decides he's happy with whatever settlement, we could turn the music, or he could turn the music off. Same with Hizb Islamic Al-Budin. It's infamous for its massive levels of discipline. It may have eroded slightly over the past 30 years, but it's still a pretty disciplined organization. And my impression is that IMU is pretty similar. So these are, they're decentralized in the sense that the Wehrmacht was decentralized in World War II, right? People get a lot of mission-type orders to go figure out how to do something. But decentralized is not the same as a collective of autonomous entities. So I think that there is enough central decision-making to hold these organizations together. If, again, for no other reason, that resources flow both ways, up and down the chain of command, and if you start disobeying, then there are a variety of sanctions, including having resources cut off or maybe your head cut off, that can be imposed upon you by the senior leadership, potentially. On Kim's point, I mean, Iraq, look, there's always going to be the potential for issues with patronage, but I question whether Iraq would be better off had we never undertaken the patronage that we did. I mean, there would still be resource distribution issues inside Iraq. There would have been resource distribution issues inside Egypt. And look, we got a substantial benefit for more than 3 decades from our patronage relationship with the Egyptians. I mean, at some point, everything's going to change, but I think 3 decades is a pretty good amount of time. On the CT inside the United States, I mean, you can look no further than the creation of the Intelligence Division of the New York Police Department as a major counterterrorism innovation that has been controversial but pretty effective. So I mean, there have been substantial efforts to sort of develop this kind of apparatus.
Okay, Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Khan. I'm a student here at the Political Science Department. My question is for Professor Cooley. You mentioned in the second part of your presentation a tendency on part of Russia and China to codify actions being carried out in the name of counterterrorism, whereas the U.S. has engaged in a lot of outsourcing, both geographically as with Guantanamo and by way of actors, so outsourcing to contractors. My question is, what would you say explains this variation in response, and does it say more about the nature and extent of the actions being carried out, or does it reflect more about the difference in these countries and how they negotiate international law and norms?
Right. Interesting. Want to take that one?
Hi, my name's Andrea Besoris, and I'm a local bank analyst, and I'd been a student at Columbia back in the 80s. Mr. Long, you made an interesting parallel or comparison with the Wehrmacht, because I'm curious about the growing or the more apparent German hegemony that has perhaps become a little more powerful now that they're fully funded East Germany, and the reunification of it has enabled Germany to be more comfortable to engage internationally, militaristically, than it had in, so it's more evident. And I see this and I hear this. And so what are thoughts about that? And it's been sort of an obscure actor behind the scenes, but has enjoyed riding on the coattails of the United States with regard to the facility of Cold War between, which had been a German policy because it was Kaiser Germany policy to keep Germany constantly on war footing. while it was consolidating. So what's the, what observations with regard to, and Mr. Cooley also, talked about the indirect, there are indirect or obscure participants in this, or parties enjoying that other people take the flak, whereas they themselves will be benefactors. And my concern also is with regard to where commercial war really is the issue. So what are your thoughts that many of these protagonists and terrorists and rebels are really for commercial purposes? Because when you understand what the Fourth Reich has been doing and who and what they are, and their commercial and cultural war, and where we've just, to the degree that we've sort of been so totally co-opted by those interests and have just really failed to clean up those problems here in the United States. And as a result, it just spreads about the world, suiting the purposes of commercial and cultural war for the elite and the commercial powers. So if you could speak to those two issues. Thanks.
All right, one more.
Thank you. My name is Ben Todashek. I am a student at SIPA, studying international security policy and human rights, because I'm about to change. And I was
Wait, which way are you going?
Just like I'm not going to assign names to the arguments I'm about to sum up, I don't want to assign myself a label. I'll tell you after. I guess my question pertains to what is the root cause of terrorism, which is probably the central question of this panel and a lot of the op-eds coming out 10 years after the attacks. This is by far the best and most rich source of information I've seen anywhere in the ether, so thank you guys so much. I guess I've seen three basic strands. One is that the type of terrorism that we're mainly concerned about today is Islamist rather. And then I sort of sensed the majority of the panelists disagreeing with that. One argument was that it comes from political inequality or lack of political representation. But if we accept Professor Fortna's definition of terrorism, then it appears that it's a plurality of different issues, one of which is democracy, the presence of a democracy. Of course, the state where the terrorism originates doesn't have to be democratic. I know that you're talking about the state that actually gets attacked, and for transnational terrorism, the democracy in the state wouldn't necessarily cause terrorism to occur. But I still think that there's a tension between this issue of political representation, and maybe I'm wrong, and the fact that democracies are sort of a magnet for this symbolic form of political violence that can propel a population that receives pain to act in the interests of the terrorists. And I even think that Professor Fortna's finding that half as much of the time political terrorist organizations reach a negotiated settlement is sort of interesting in the sense that there seems to be some kind of just success story there. It's not quite clear to me. What is the cause of terrorism? Is it self-interested? Is it... I want to finish with, maybe this will clear up my questions. The Arab Spring, some have argued was caused by inequality. But one professor at Barnard, Professor, oh man, blanking on her name, I never got to take her. She argues that the political inequality actually caused the uprising in Egypt, which obviously was nonviolent. And so I was just wondering if anybody wants to jump to the front and sort of sum up where the debate is on what the root cause of terrorism actually is. And I'm sorry if I sort of botched up my understandings of the arguments. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take another round of responses. How wanted to that?
Yeah. First of all, on the question of Islamist terrorism, Stephen Fish from the University of California at Berkeley has a new book out, and I'm blanking out on the exact title, but he goes through a huge amount of statistical data on the question of whether around the world people who profess Islam as a religion are any different from people who profess other religions. And one of his findings are that, in fact, 75% of terrorist attacks that have happened in the past 10 years have been conducted by people who explicitly consider themselves to be acting on behalf of Islamism. In other words, of trying to replace an existing government with a government that was under a particular Muslim influenced kind of government. But that more than half of those have been committed within the countries where the people who committed the acts of terrorism were based, and so this goes back again to the locality of the issue, and that in fact Muslims as a whole do not support the idea of violent solutions to political actions or to replacing existing governments with people who follow their own religion any more than any other religious people do. And so it sort of is the data go in one direction but not in the other direction. Obviously, the vast majority of those terrorist attacks probably occurred on the ground in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and we can all think of other places in the world where people who were explicitly Islamist were conducting attacks that were probably based on political inequality measures, like Chechnya, for example, in Russia. And one other thing to think about in terms of religion is that it provides a sense of personal networks that might reinforce the way that people approach things. And one of the things that's been tried in some European mosques is to see if a sentiment of solving problems through nonviolent means is something that would prevent people who might be Islamist in their orientation to think about peaceful mechanisms to get Islamist solutions. Just wanted to say in passing, to answer once more this debate that I'm having with Austin, that just because something worked for 30 years didn't mean it was the best solution that could be tried, and that I'm going to be advising a SEPA course in spring semester that will look at the problem of corruption along the northern supply network going into Afghanistan and whether there's a solution. Is that right? Okay.
I just want to add one thing to the Al-Qaeda and Islam issue. It's not just the religion of Islam, obviously. I want to point out that Anders Breivik, the Norway shooter, I think is a good example of something very similar to what we've seen with the Al-Qaeda movement over the last few decades, and you could really go back centuries if you wanted to, but the ideological foundations of the particular movement based on certain, what they would say, political grievances and historical evolutions and illegitimate leaders not representing their culture anymore and things like that. If you have some spare time, you should leaf through Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto about global civilizational revolutionary war, pitting the West against what he calls, quote, Islamic cultural imperialism. It was a virtual mirror image of the manifestos emanating from Ayman al-Zawahiri and Anwar al-Awlaki and other al-Qaeda ideologues. So we have to remember it's a combination of forces. It's a combination of a culture that, or certain representatives of a culture that feel aggrieved and are willing to use violence against historical forces that they think are working against them. But just like, and I still disagree a little bit on the international and domestic nexus. I don't want to go too much into it, but if we have individuals like Major Hassan who did the shooting at Fort Hood, he was an American citizen that committed a domestic act of terrorism, but he was clearly motivated by international global concerns and radicalized internationally from Anwar al-Awlaki himself. So in terms of political science, how we categorize that, if that's going to be categorized as a domestic attack and part of a matrix of this is another domestic attack, so most attacks are domestic and not international, I think it's very fuzzy at this point. That kind of thing. And the same thing for Breivik, because he says, I'm Norwegian, but I'm not Norwegian. I'm European, I'm Western. And so I think it's very interesting. And it could hopefully, not expand and bring, more into that cause, but hopefully that's the end of it, obviously.
Okay. Professor Cooley.
Yeah. I think the question about what explains these different sort of frameworks for these sort of counterterrorism efforts and sort of erosion of human rights norms is a very good one. I don't think I have an answer to it, but I would caution against the simple norm story here for a couple of reasons. One, on the China case, China, contrary to sort of this original prevailing wisdom that there's a Beijing consensus and supports authoritarian norms and so forth, China, in my view anyway, tends to calibrate the prevailing norms of each region that it deals with, right? And so this is why you saw China pretty much stand out of the way in the Arab Spring, right? And similarly in Central Asia, I think it's calibrating to a level that it feels comfortable with and necessary to secure its support on the question of Uyghur sort of separatism. Russia's tricky, right? Because on the one hand, you would say, a regime led by President Putin for most of this time, maybe still led by Prime Minister Putin, is so antithetical to sort of Western norms, human rights norms, and yet, of the three countries that all engaged in extraordinary renditions, Russia is the only one to pull them back in response to international pressure. And why is that? Because it's a member of the European Court of Human Rights. So there are several cases where the European Court of Human Rights has actually stayed Russian actions in terms of some of these renditions. And the most famous case is the Ivanovo case of 14 Uzbeks living in Russia that were demanded by the government of Uzbekistan in conjunction or in relation to what they were doing in Andijan. And the Russian government heeded the warning by the European Court. Hasn't done so in all cases, but I think of the three, they are the most susceptible to international normative pressure. So the norms question and story, I think, is a very intriguing one, but really tricky. I don't think there's a direct kind of route there. There might be a what's the word I'm looking for? A circular route there, but maybe it's one that you can find out and enlighten us on. On the question of sort of the industry behind this and the economic incentives and so forth, also tricky. Austin's obviously the stats guy, so I'll defer to him on the exact multiple now of U.S. combat troops in Iraq to contractors. I don't know if it's 5-1, 6-1, 7-1. When the conflict began, contractors were a fraction of combat troops, and now that's the reverse. And you see this trend throughout the world. But you also see it, especially in the area of intelligence and counterintelligence, the outsourcing of a lot of intelligence activities to the private sector. And I think you've seen a lot of this in Central Asia. The commercialization of incentives, Kim alluded to this in NDN. I mean, what always sort of intrigues me about the sort of Central Asia, post-Soviet Central Asia, Afghanistan comparison is sort of behind the curtain of what we're trying to do in Afghanistan, we have institutionalized a whole set of patrimonial arrangements to try and secure Central Asian state support for logistical cooperation with what's going on in Afghanistan. And in fact, General Petraeus waived standard contracting regulations because he wanted to encourage the U.S. military to buy local for some Central Asian countries and offer them economic incentives to engage. Now, people say, no, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to do if you're trying to get this cooperation. As Austin said, it's pick your poison. It's Pakistan or Russia and Central Asia. But there is a kind of a behind-the-curtains kind of dynamic going on where officially we're combating corruption in Afghanistan, and then we're sort of, I would say, even institutionalizing it through some of our practices in Central Asia. So yes, there is a lot of money to be made this effort. Sometimes it's the strategy to gain cooperation for this effort, but as long as Afghanistan is the compelling strategic goal, policymakers will tell you it's part of what we need to do. My final point on this would be, I can accept that argument, but only if then we sort of list these arrangements on the negative side of the ledger of the cost of Afghanistan, right? Saying, by pursuing Afghanistan, we're doing this in Uzbekistan. We're doing this with the Tajiks, with the Kyrgyz, the Bakievs, or whatever. It's a cost of Afghanistan, as opposed to sort of dancing around it a little bit and trying to massage what we're doing. If we're clear on what the ledger is, I think maybe that also helps us make more informed calculations. So I'll just leave it at that.
Professor Fortner.
So I have a comment that addresses this issue of Islam and terrorism, but then it relates to a more general point that I think gets to some of your question, Ben, about political inequality and terrorism. So, Kim, if I heard you right, Fish is saying that 75% of those individuals who've committed a terrorist attack are Muslim, or claiming...
No, it's not that they're Muslim. It's that they have explicitly stated that their goal is Islamist.
Okay.
So that they want to replace a current government with a Muslim government.
Okay. So, I mean, one issue is whether Fish is working off the State Department FTO list, in which case we can just throw this. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the same premise behind the ones that I...
Right, but okay, but the broader point is that the Islamic world has been the site of political contention of all forms lately, right? So if you counted the percentage of peaceful protesters who come from the Islamic world in the last year, it would be extraordinarily high given the Arab Spring, right? So I think, but the broader point is that we need to distinguish between what are the causes of political grievance and contestation and organization to try to change things, and then what are the causes of those things turning violent, and this is going to get to the point about democracy, and then what are the causes of that turning to terrorism, right? So on the democracy or the political opportunity point, democracies are much, much less likely to experience a civil war because there are other political outlets for changing the system or for expressing grievance. But if they have a civil war, they're much more likely to have that turn to terrorism because terrorism is more effective against democracies and against non-democracies. So I think in separating these things, and if we're talking about the root cause of terrorism, well, first of all, do you mean the root cause of contestation? Do you mean the root cause of violence? Do you mean the root cause, given those things, of terrorism? So I think that a lot of these kind of findings in the literature and you know, all this stuff, that distinction needs really to be made clearly, and it generally isn't made clearly.
Well, I mean, that does bring up the question, though. The point was Islamists, not from the Muslim world, right? I mean, and that is a distinction. I don't know Fish's data well enough, but I do sometimes get a little concerned. I mean, we have to distinguish between what is social science and what is sort of U.S. policy interest. The vast majority of terrorists may not be Islamist. The ones of most, sort of salience to attacks on the U.S. homeland, at least at the present time, do appear to be. So I worry that we sort of dance around that a little too much at times and say, in the broad universe of things, Islam does not show up as any different, and it probably doesn't. But in the present context, the Norwegian lunatics of the world are not lining up to come over here, at least yet. I mean, give it time. On the question of Germany, Germany is still intensely uncomfortable with the use of force. They are actually maybe not right now, I'd have to look, but they're roughly the third largest troop contributor to the effort in Afghanistan. They may actually be second. But they have a lot of what are called national caveats on how they exercise the use of force. And there's a strong argument that parts of northern Afghanistan have gotten less stable despite being, majority Tajik and should be fairly inhospitable to the Taliban, in part because the Germans have not done such a great job of handling that region. And in fact, the Germans have scrupulously avoided acknowledging that they're in a war, right? They don't call it counterinsurgency to the extent that they can help it. There really isn't a German word for counterinsurgency, at least I'm told. I'm not a German speaker myself. So, the attitude about military force, it's different than it was, say, 30 years ago, but I don't see a Germany that is going to spring onto the world stage and begin throwing its military weight around. Economic weight, is different. Clearly, of all the European countries, they've weathered the late unpleasantness best, and therefore, in a sense, in the driver's seat, but it's maybe not a great driver's seat to be in. It's sort of the Thomas Schelling-esque, you've thrown the steering wheel out and tied yourself to the car situation, in terms of they've lashed themselves to the euro and to Europe in ways that German taxpayers are now finding to maybe not have been the best idea in the world.
So both Professor Portna and Professor Martin wanted to jump in briefly, and then we'll take the next round of questions.
So just in response to that, I certainly agree that there's a difference between kind of terrorism globally and terrorism that the U.S. happens to care about the most at the moment. I think the thing that's important to distinguish, though, is if the terrorism that the U.S. cares about at the moment is predominantly or overwhelmingly Islamist, is that something to do with Islam and Islamicism, or is that something to do with where the U.S. is involved in the world and foreign policy interests and where those policies are most controversial in the countries, domestically within those countries? So I think there's kind of a quick, not so much within academia, maybe a little bit more in the popular press, but more just kind of in the kind of general person's understanding of things, that if a terrorist is Islamist, it must have something to do with Islam. And I think that's highly questionable. I don't think that's what you're saying.
No.
I just want to quickly remind us all that social science deals with broad patterns and with probabilistic statements about how things are related to each other, and is not very good at making point predictions, and certainly can never say anything about a lone wolf or a Norwegian crazy person acting. So, okay, please.
Yeah, I'm from Shanghai International Studies University and was granted as the Fulbright visiting researcher hosted at East Asia, Weatherhead East Asia Institute. And 10 years ago, I was in New York and experienced the September 11th personally. I was working in Chinese Consulate General in New York. And I remember after the September 11th, there was a broad question raised nationwide: why do they hate us? Yes, it forced us to rethink about the U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. public diplomacy, as well as the U.S. images overseas, especially in the Middle East, and also aroused us enough attention to those non-traditional security factors. So today, I was impressed by the presentation given by Professor Martin, and give the analysis of terrorism with social science perspective. And my question is quite general. After 10 years anti-terrorism, how to evaluate U.S. present security situations nationwide and worldwide? Even better or even worse? It seems these days a lot of arguments involved. And my second question specific goes to Professor Coley. Maybe there's Professor's points there that anti-terrorism is a kind of civil war. But I think it needs the new international regime design. And you have already mentioned the China-Russian cooperation, or to some extent China-US cooperation. My question is, do you think the possibilities sometime in the future, maybe some triangle, pre-aliens, or cooperations among the three powers, US, China, and Russian? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jordan Brensinger, and I'm a current Master of International Affairs student here at SIPA. I thank you all for your contribution to the panel. This is a relatively new, security in particular is a relatively new field for me. In reflecting on the past 10 years since 9/11, and having spent a number of those years abroad, I am particularly interested in the degeneration of the American image that I've witnessed while spending time overseas, and how that's affected me as an American individual. As a development practitioner, I'm interested in knowing whether or not that is an irreversible trend. If not, how can we understand particularly international cooperation, both between countries and also across sectors like security and development?
Hi, my name is Aaron Penguin. I'm a second-year ISB student here at SIPA, and I just want to hear a little bit more about the panel's thoughts about our current domestic capacity and performance in regards to terrorist threats. What is the state of the Department of Homeland Security and the resulting policies of the Patriot Act, and are there areas for reform that we should be looking forward in the next few years? Thank you.
I'm really glad that we've gotten beyond the why do they hate us discussion, partly because I think the they was really vague, and partly because I think hate was not really the right term to use in talking about what was motivating what was going on. So I'm glad we're beyond that too. In terms of where we are now compared to where we are then, including on domestic security but also on international security questions, I think the U.S. has learned, and I think that all of the research that has been done on causes of terrorism has actually helped the U.S. to learn. Yes, we did do renditions. As far as I know, we don't do them anymore, or at least if we don't do them, if we do them now, it's tiny. We did do torture. The evidence that has been publicly released is that it wasn't very many people who were actually tortured. It was like a couple dozen at most, maybe even less than that. But the amount of international outrage that was caused by that, I think caused the U.S. to really rethink. That means everybody in the U.S., and I would just point out that most military officers never supported the idea of torture, that was coming from the civilians in the Defense Department, not from the military. And I think the big question about human rights and about the effect that policies will have on justice and political perceptions of whether the United States is fair or not and whether it contributes to political inequality and nastiness or not is now centering on a question that it would be good if we could resolve the debate about numbers, and that is, do drone strikes hit civilians? And obviously both sides have an incentive to release information that is misleading, but I would guess that that's where a lot of the political justice questions are hitting today.
Oh yeah, just very briefly, I think one of the things, and this wasn't directed at me, over the last 10 years that we see is an erosion of U.S. credibility, prestige, influence in Central Asia. Clearly, I mean, if this is a microcosm of where the world is going, now that doesn't mean the U.S. hasn't been able to do what it wanted to do, right? Because the money, the security cooperation, right, all in the end worked, right? But it has come at a cost, and the cost is, some would call it sort of soft power, some would call it moral authority, whatever. If you just look at the latest batch of WikiLeaks dumps sort of describing meetings between Karimov and Central Asian leaders, the first thing they say in every meeting is, oh, you're double standards. You torture, you do all this kind of thing. So it's a problem. I think the other aspect of this, though, beyond the credibility, is I think you're seeing this is an era where other countries now have mechanisms of influence that the U.S. exclusively used to monopolize and control. For instance, the provision of international public goods. Who's the big actor building infrastructure in Central Asia? It's China, right? I mean, there's more money going into Chinese roads than the World Bank has ever allocated, or so forth. So I think it's slowly but steadily some of the functions that the U.S. used to play as sort of a hegemon are being eroded in these regions, and that's not necessarily bad for development. I think it's quite good that these roads are being built. But I think it's just another sort of signal of the difference now and sort of 10 years ago. On sort of the potential for U.S., Russia, China, triangular cooperation, we had a conference about this in CSIS. I think it's really difficult. And part of the reason it's difficult is not that we don't have certain common interests, is that triangles structurally are inherently unstable, right? The two sides on the triangle are always looking to the third, right? And saying, oh my gosh, we've just been ganged up on, I'm going to forge this alliance. And you get this if you go to Moscow a little bit and you talk to analysts about sort of perceptions, you'll see it's not an even split, but you will find people who say, gosh, we're so concerned about China now, maybe we should have better relations with the West, right? And sort of, balance against sort of China that's sort of looming and so forth. And so that's the difficult thing. And I think the sort of microcosm of what you saw on September 11th, sort of the Chinese pivoting, then the Russians pivoting, our concern about a potential, Russian-Chinese axis, I think just points to the structural difficulties of doing that. But certainly more institutionalized forums and dialogues can't be a bad thing.
Can I add one quick thing to that?
Yeah.
On the and it also dovetails a little bit into the question of America's the view of the world about America's leadership and things like that. There was a ton of cooperation after 9/11, yep. And there remains a lot of cooperation. I agree with you 100% on Russia and China. It started in a popular way because the world united with the United States after 9/11, but it evolved even after the Bush administration became very unpopular and a lot of the policies came out. One of the little known secrets is that most of the rest of the world continued to cooperate with the United States secretly, including European countries that had, just populations that were despising the United States at that particular point. The story that has not yet been told is the amount of that cooperation, not just with Russia and China, which it's a little easier to understand, and they have their own domestic threats that they perceive as linked in with the terrorist threats, global terrorist threats. But the Europeans, that book hasn't been written yet, but the European countries, and I could tell stories which we don't have time for, but one small one would be in Italy. There was a rendition of a sheikh in Milan, and there was outrage all across Europe. And years later, there was an indictment in Italy against the roughly 20 CIA agents in absentia, and they did this big show trial, very symbolic and important to the Europeans to cleanse themselves and disassociate with the Americans. And the further up they got up the chain of command, they realized the director of military intelligence knew about the rendition, and then the prime minister's office was brought into play, and then they stopped that part of the investigation and just kept it on the American CIA agents, and kind of had these absentia prosecutions and felt good about themselves.
It's a very good point. And who signed off on all these sort of black sites and the air, the landing rights for these refuels and so forth? I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as the chair at this point and ask, as kind of a summary question to bring it back to the overall theme of the panel, 9/11, and what about, what have we learned, what do we know about the future? And I'm going to ask kind of a speculative question of the panel and give you each 3 minutes to respond, even though this is going to be tight. So, David Singer of the New York Times right now is all over the news talking about the direct costs of 9/11 and the indirect costs, and he characterizes a lot of these indirect costs as costs of choice. So things that we as a country, as the U.S. government, took on in response. And he's asking a lot of really interesting, good questions about, on the level of, was it worth it? Were in some cases these costs that we've incurred, have they been counterproductive? And so I wanted to kind of throw out a scenario. So imagine there is another foreign-based al-Qaeda attack. So we know it's al-Qaeda, it's not off on any of these other groups. And to make it a little more concrete, say it's an act of sabotage on a nuclear power plant, also kills hundreds of Americans, very upsetting. What, if anything, might happen differently this time around? So given that we still have a lot of the same kind of political constraints that we had before, but we've ostensibly learned a lot. We've learned a lot through policy, we've learned a lot through academic research, and also keeping in mind that the world is a different place now than it was 10 years ago, in part due to a lot of the policy choices we've made. So, scenario again? So just to make it concrete, a nuclear kind of sabotage attack on a nuclear power plant domestically.
Do you know who did it?
Based, al-Qaeda. Okay. So foreign-based al-Qaeda.
Based where?
Sorry?
Based where? Sorry. Foreign-based where?
Foreign-based...
New Jersey.
Saudi Arabia, Pakistan.
Okay.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia, Pakistan.
Yeah, I don't know. You can tell I'm not an expert on this stuff. Okay. So, so the two-part question is: what might happen differently, and what, based on your research, would you emphasize if you were tapped to give some advice to the NSC about what they should be paying attention to? So, so the different. The different parts here are what should we be paying attention to, and what do you think we actually will, how do we think we actually will respond given what we've learned nevertheless? Okay.
I go first?
That was quick.
One thing I think that we've learned, and this goes back into the America's image around the world a little bit, which I think we recognize is much more important than the Bush administration originally thought. They thought that if we were just fighting a virtuous war against evil, as they would portray it, then the world would just rally behind us. That ended pretty quickly. So I think we could learn something from the Obama administration, which maintained the same sort of hardline policies, but repackaged them in a different way that they're not going to be popular in large parts of the world. I think there have been a tremendous amount of deaths of civilians with drone strikes and other operations, some of which we don't know about or can't talk about. So I think that's the number one thing would be we wouldn't go with this smoke them out either with us or against us kind of rhetoric. And the second thing, now that's the good side. The bad side is, and this is a view I've had for a while, and I've lived through some of this stuff. Terrorist attacks like that, in my opinion, politically, are the great sleeping giant of American politics. And it'll be and I agree that we're never going to completely eliminate terrorism. And as much as smart political leaders are going to try to educate the American people that this is just going to happen from time to time, and as Beth said and I said in my beginning, we can't overreact to it because it's just going to make the matters worse and create a cycle. nonetheless, in a democracy, and this is something more Paige about, democracies reacting policy-wise rather than focus on the context of who's rising up against them. Democracies are under tremendous pressure also to protect the public, and you often do see shifts to the right and shifts to certain hardline tactics. You saw that in Israel after 2000. You saw that in the United States after the 9/11 attacks. So I think we would also end up with some pretty hardline policies as well. Some of them would remain a little bit more secret. Let me counter your thing for half a second. If it wasn't just a one-time attack, but there was also, like the 9/11 attacks, there was a suspicion that we didn't know enough about who the enemy was and how many more attacks were coming, that was the genesis of torture. That was the genesis of coercive interrogations. 3 individuals were tortured under those procedures in 18 months, and then that system essentially stopped. But we still were engaging in renditions, and we still are. But I believe that if there was still a swirl that was one of several potential attacks, we would probably see this current administration or any administration act very similar to the way the Bush administration did. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying that's reality. And they wouldn't come out and say we're going to do torture memos and make them public someday and have the Inspector General release them to the public. That's never going to happen again. But they would probably engage in those similar policies for the main reason that they are responsible, and they're going to be held responsible and accountable. And I think, unfortunately, in that scenario, we would see America go pretty hardcore, although we would probably package it a little bit differently because we saw some of those major costs after 9/11.
One just quick informational question for Stuart. When you say we're still doing renditions, do you mean we are still capturing people in foreign countries and sending them to countries where we know they will be tortured?
Absolutely. Oh, well, we're not saying we know that they will be tortured.
Not that we say publicly, but are we doing this?
Yes, yes.
What is your evidence of that?
We can talk after. It's at least as much as we were doing after 4 or 5 years after 9/11.
That's very disturbing, but I'd like to see the evidence.
We replaced coercive interrogations with 2 things. More rendition. When Obama outlawed torture, we replaced it with 2 things. Number 1, more renditions. So we outsourced the information we gather, which, by the way, is not as reliable anymore. We don't have oversight over who's doing the information gathering. And number 2, we replaced it with drone strikes. And we're now killing a lot of these individuals instead of capturing them and interrogating them. So instead of the waterboard.
Drone strikes, I buy very much, but I would be very surprised if you're actually correct that we are rendering people on a regular basis to be tortured. Just because my sense is that
I didn't say we're doing it on a regular basis to be tortured.
My sense, well, that's what extraordinary rendition meant. And let me finish this thought, okay? The reason that I would be surprised about this is because my understanding is that the general perception among people who practice international security policy in the administration and in the bureaucracies in the United States have come to the agreement that information that is gathered under torture doesn't tend to be very reliable. And that the only time that it ever would make sense to put anybody into that extreme situation is if there was an immediate threat of an attack. For example, if somebody had people who were being kept hostage that they were threatening to kill. And so it would really surprise me if we're still doing extraordinary rendition the way that it was being done immediately after September 11th, but I'd like to see your evidence.
Yeah, I didn't say immediately after 9/11.
Okay, so I think this is a subject for another panel.
Okay, so let me just get on to what I think would happen. I think that there would not be a witch hunt of ethnic groups the way that there sort of was a witch hunt against immigrants immediately following September 11th, because I think we've learned about the importance of political inclusiveness because the political exclusion and the thought of not having fair treatment is associated with terrorism. I think that instead we would be turning more at a domestic level to neighborhood local policing that is very sympathetic to local groups because there's an understanding that sympathy is a better way of getting information. I think in terms of foreign events, there would be airstrikes rather than on-the-ground forces sent because there's not a desire to have another large on-the-ground military presence. I think if it were in fact the case that this attack came from people who were in Pakistan, it would very likely just completely end our cooperation with Pakistan. I think that the pressure would become enormous to stop saying that Pakistan was any kind of ally whatsoever. I think it would speed up our withdrawal from Afghanistan and increase our cooperation with India.
I don't have too much more to add to that. I would just say, as both previous panels say, sort of the stylistic approach I think would be different, and that really is a lesson learned, that even if you're going to engage in many of the similar sort of tactics, the framing of them as more of a global multilateral kind of enterprise is quite important. One thing I would just say, lessons learned, is the media environment now, the global media environment is very different than it was 10 years ago. This is now an era where we have Russia Today, China International just started broadcasting. We all know about Al Jazeera and its importance in the Arab Spring. And so, you know, it's not as if the United States hasn't always struggled with security versus values, or double standards, or doing different kinds of deals with different kinds of places. So, you know, it's always been the case. The problem that U.S. policymakers now face is that instantaneously these what I call sort of hypocrisy costs are broadcast, right? That the sort of split screen of what we're doing in Uzbekistan versus what we're trying to promote in Iraq is just so immediate. It's so pressing that our contradictory policies towards Libya and Egypt are there for everyone to see. And so, you know, that makes the sort of nudging of these things, the invocation of sort of more, you know, principle-based sort of action a lot more difficult than it was in the past, even though really we've faced these dilemmas in many different eras.
I also don't have a whole lot to add. I guess there's what I hope we have learned, but I'm not entirely sure we have learned. I would hope that the response would be much more focused on the group that attacked us and where they had been harbored, and whoever had been harboring. That's why I asked you sort of to specify who it was, as opposed to, say, another state that had nothing to do with the initial attacks, Iraq. I hope that would be true, and I hope there would be more of an appreciation of the fact that really the main way that such attacks can be effective is in promoting an overreaction, and that would keep us from overreacting. I don't know that it would for whoever was mentioning the sort of domestic politics within the U.S. and the need to sort of take a hard line. I think it would also, what would happen would depend in part on what had happened between now and these hypothetical attacks in terms of the drawdown in Afghanistan and how that would play politically. I don't know how it would play politically, but if we had completely withdrawn and then there's an attack, would there be blaming of, oh, we got out too soon, we left this, or how that would play out? It would depend on where the attack came from and what kind of information there was about it, and maybe that sets you up, maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
So I don't know how many of you have seen the Coen Brothers movie, Burn After Reading, but there's a scene at the end where a character that's representing a CIA division chief talking about some shenanigans that have gone on in the movie says, well, what do we learn from this? And he kind of looks around, nobody has an answer. He says, well, I guess we learned not to effing do that again. And I think that is true both of the United States, but crucially of a lot of other countries. So what have we learned? We have learned that maybe invading countries that sort of kind of we don't like and maybe looks, if you squint really hard, kind of look like the people that attacked us, i.e. Iraq, is maybe a terrible idea. I think that we have immunized ourselves, at least for a generation, against that sort of foolishness. So that's good, if costly. But it doesn't get us out of the problem that we had facing the Taliban regime in the fall of 2001, which is we said, look, we don't want to fight you. Cough up bin Laden, and we'll call it a day. And they said, well, no, maybe we'll drag our feet. And we were not in a foot-dragging kind of mood, nor would we be in the scenario that Tanya posits. So what have other people learned? Well, other people have learned that a good way to lose your country is to be non-responsive when the United States says, we want terrorist X. The Pakistanis have certainly learned this. They are incredibly uncooperative in many ways on helping us against their proxies in Afghanistan. But, as recent arrests have shown, they continue, despite all of the fallout of the bin Laden raid, et cetera, they continue to arrest al-Qaeda affiliates. So that's good. The same is true of the Saudis. They let money flow out of their country that supports various causes. But there's not much terrorism based inside Saudi Arabia as opposed to sort of money flowing out that goes to terrorists. So other countries have learned that this is a bad deal. So what would happen in the scenario that Tanya posits? In the case of Saudi Arabia, they would be beside themselves to find who did it and get them to us if they didn't just cut their heads off themselves. The Saudis are, sometimes ineffectual but quite ruthless. For those of you who haven't read the book, The Siege of Mecca, I would recommend it. It's sort of the kickoff event of the age of Islamic terror. And that's the holy of holies, and they were happy to shell the hell out of that place. So The Saudis, sensing that something bad could be in the wind, would be quick to do everything they could. Pakistanis probably would be as well, because the end of the relationship with the United States has real consequences for them, and it's even worse if we decide, oh, by the way, we're going to start doing what we did with bin Laden on a massive scale. They don't want to get into a war with the U.S. They will if they have to, but they have no great love for al-Qaeda, so they would do whatever they could, and they can be awfully ruthless and nasty too, to hand over at least somebody. So I think it would look, in many ways, quite different from the post-9/11 response in ways that would be ugly and maybe we don't want to see, but would be a lot less costly in the long run. Oh, and just one note on drones. Drones don't substitute for capturing people. We would love to capture all of the people we kill with drones. The problem is they're not places we can easily and safely get to. Drones are a very specific technical solution to a weird political problem, which is this sort of ungoverned nation-state spaces. So they're used in areas where rendition would be difficult, if not impossible, because not only do we lack a real presence there, the actual host nation government lacks a presence. So yeah, we would by all means love to capture and interrogate all of these dudes. It's just kind of tough to do so when they're in somebody else's territory and that somebody doesn't like you being there.
Tanya, could I jump in for half a second on that?
Half a second.
I don't agree with that. The Obama administration does not want to capture all these people and interrogate them and find places to put them because they're under extreme stress on whether to have military commissions or not. And we've not seen the amount of
But we
people
still
captured.
are capturing them. They are capturing them in Afghanistan. We just don't capture them in Pakistan much.
Well,
I mean, we still have a facility at Bagram. In fact, Bagram has come to substitute in some ways for Guantanamo. You're absolutely
no,
right.
I agree, but that's exactly the point.
They-
It's not. Well, we can talk more about this, but
Well, sure, but my point is, Osama bin Laden probably accepted. We would like to interrogate most of these guys.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'd like everybody to join me in thanking this fantastic panel, and also thanks to the audience for a really great set of questions, and thank you very much for your time today.